Glad to have you back with us, and glad to have Dr. Jared Bernstein on the line with us, Senior Fellow with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities at cbpp.org is the website. Former chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, the guy who, well, he's just done amazing stuff with his life. And Dr. Bernstein, welcome back to the program.
Well, thanks for that nice introduction, and glad to be back here.
It is, yeah, it's been a year or so, I think, since we talked. You have a fascinating piece in today's Washington Post. Hillary Clinton calls for smart and fair trade. What is that?
That's exactly the title of my piece. What is that?
Right.
So in the debate with Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton said, as opposed to Trump's ideas, which I'm quite critical of for renegotiating the way forward vis-a-vis trade, she said, well, we should do smart, fair trade, but she didn't get to say much of what that is. And so what it is it starts from the premise that the problem with our current trade negotiations and trade deals is that at the core of those agreements are represented the interests of multinational corporations and not those of workers and consumers. And if you start there at the core and you recognize that trade deals that put workers and consumers at their core are going to look very different than ones that put the interests of multinational at the core, that takes you to issues around currency management and manipulation. It takes you to issues around this investment state dispute settlement question. It helps you figure out who you should be putting in as trading partners in the first place, environmental and labor rights, lots of different, it takes you in a very different direction regarding the rules of the road.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I think a lot of people fail to get, and I'd love to hear you riff on this, is just to take this all the way back to fundamentals. I mean, back to Adam Smith kind of fundamentals, which is economies don't, outside of just simple barter economies, you know, you wash my car, I'll mow your lawn. But economies in general don't spring out of nothing. They are created. Just like a football game doesn't spring out of nothing, it's created. You say, here's the field, here are the goalposts, here are the rules. These are the people who are going to be the referees. It is, you know, there are rules created for this, and these are created by governments. Governments create the currency that is used to make the economy function. Define the rules of the economy, pay for the systems to adjudicate those rules, the court systems, the jails, you know, to punish the malefactors of those rules, all that stuff. And so if we, the people, our government, you know, the first three words of our Constitution, if we, the people, are going to set up an economy, why do we do that? And I would argue that, you know, using just relatively recent history, from 1933 until 1980, the explicit and understood across the spectrum in our society reason why we had our economy, why, you know, and why it was set up the way it was to benefit the working people of this country and thus strengthen the country. And since 1980, we've been in this relatively continuous era of Reaganomics, that the economy has been reconfigured under Reaganomics and trade policy as well, which started changing significantly, you know, a little bit with Nixon and a lot more with Reagan, and then in the 90s. That our trade policies prior to that time were pure, you know, largely to protect American workers, based on Alexander Hamilton's 11-point plan back in 1791, or 1793, I guess, was when it was put into place, when he delivered it to Congress. From then until Reagan, you know, it was to benefit working people and the economy of the United States. Since Reagan, it's been, our trade policies have been largely to benefit the corporate few, as you point out. Your thoughts on that analysis, and if I'm correct in this, how do we communicate that?
Yeah, I think the analysis is largely correct and very much like my own, in the sense that clearly the structure of any economy is one that is a function of political power, of who has standing in the society, and in fact, whose kind of skin is in the game, whose values are at the heart of the model that you're creating. And the evidence of that is you can look across the land and see very different approaches to this. But let me be very concrete about that where it comes to trade. So we've had very large trade deficits since that kind of 1980 turning point you just mentioned, and there's nothing wrong with a trade deficit every few years or something like that. But in fact, when you have large trade deficits for almost 30 years, it usually suggests that something's wrong.
Yeah.
And that especially a country as inherently competitive as we are, what's up with that? Well, one of the problems is that in some of those years, the countries with whom we've done business have managed their currencies to get an edge on us. But it's also the case that you can look at other advanced economies. Germany's a good example. They've had large trade surpluses. And in fact, if you look at the kinds of social provisions that are in there to help people who are hurt by globalization, they go much deeper. So I think it's very much, especially when you're talking about international trade, it really is very much a rules of the road story. And the rules of the road, as we have laid them out, as I said earlier, very much benefit the folks who are sitting at the table. And as I point out, writing those rules, and as I point out in my piece today, if you take the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, as an example, you will find that in fact 85% of those who were at the negotiating table with our trade representatives were made up of corporate interests and their trade associations. So when Big Pharma takes up 88, and Big Pharma and their colleagues take up 85%, that leaves a meager 15% for non-corporate interests. And so therefore, you get a trade deal that supposedly has the word free in it. It says it's a free trade deal, but in fact, it extends patents on medicines that are very important to some of these emerging economies. And the only way our Congress would put a stamp on this trade deal, it hasn't passed yet, but the only way they would pass it is if those patents were extended. Now, what kind of a free trade deal includes extended patents and extended intellectual property rights? One that is very much managed by those who stand to gain from such arrangements.
Yeah, I think Jefferson ranted about this in letters to Madison back in 1787 about monopolies in trade. In fact, his first letter after he read the Constitution in December of 1787 said that he would work to have the Virginia delegation shoot down the Constitution if it didn't include a ban on monopolies in commerce. And what he was talking about was patents and copyrights. He finally settled, saying he felt 3 years was optimal, but he ended up losing that fight. And we have patent and copyright laws as part of the Constitution, but the point, and no ban on them, but although he himself refused to copyright or patent any of his inventions or his writings, but the fact that we no longer use the word monopoly to describe those things, I think has malinformed our political discourse. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I agree with you, and interestingly, this is something that liberals and conservatives are starting to find common ground on. And unfortunately, in these partisan times, there's not much that we can say that about. There are lots of folks who have kind of a different view of how markets should operate than me, who believe that the extent of patent protections now is really a big distortion in the economy, and the extent of occupational licensing is another thing that comes under that rubric. It doesn't mean that there's not a role for some institution that incentivizes innovation. I think we should be clear about that.
Sure.
Or for that matter, for some sort of occupational licensing. But essentially what happens is that those kinds of processes, especially in an economy like ours where both wealth is highly concentrated and money gets to buy the policy and the politics and the politicians, frankly, that it wants. And so in that kind of an economy, you're going to have a bunch of folks who are going to take what seems like a sensible patent or occupational licensing system and game it and rig it so that it becomes a kind of a rent-seeking operation, meaning that they're able to extract a level of profitability from their ideas that go way beyond what what you'd need in a sane society to generate such ideas. And that's now viewed as highly inefficient by parties on all sides of the aisle. The problem is the people who are sitting there in Congress and making the rules are paid by folks who benefit from the current system, and that's why it's been so hard to generate reforms.
Right, and the only people pushing back on these monopolies, essentially, like Google and Microsoft kind of monopolies that are based on patent and copyright, is the European Union. They're saying, wait a minute, these are violations of our antitrust laws. Anyhow, Dr. Jared Bernstein, brilliant senior fellow center on the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, cbpp.org is the website, former chief economist, economic advisor to Joe Biden. Sir, thank you so much for being with us.